A new survey takes a look at racism in the U.S. and the roles of businesses, government, and the media. The Edelman Trust Barometer special report on business and racism found that only about 1 in 3 people surveyed believe America has made progress on racial justice over the past year. For more on this, we want to bring in Lisa Osborne Ross. She is the CEO of Edelman U.S., the company that conducted this survey. Thank you so much for joining us, Lisa. I always find the Edelman report so fascinating. So, of course, in order to tackle the problem of racism, you have to sort of clearly define what it is and who is responsible for it. So one of the things that you asked people was, is the problem a racist system or racist individuals? And what your survey found was Americans on a whole sort of believe that the problem has to do with racist individuals. But when you pull out how black people feel about that, or how younger people between the ages of 18 and 34, black people by and large believe that the issue is a racist system. And when it comes to younger people, a few more of them believe the same. What's your takeaway from these numbers?
I actually thought it was the most fascinating thing that we found. I think it is emblematic of where we are as a country. It almost feels better to say it's people, right? It's the same thing when we talk about police violence. It's some bad police officers and it's not the system. So I think it's emblematic of what the country is dealing with right now. And I am a black person. I am in that percent that believes it's the system, because we have seen that a lot of these problems are systemic and they are institutionalized. But I think it actually makes people feel better to think, oh, it's some bad people because we can correct them. But it's essential, because if it's systems, we have to work on the systems. If it's people, we have to work on the people. And I think you and I both know we have to work on both.
Yeah, because at the end of the day...
Yeah, Lisa, sorry, Vlad. Yeah. Lisa, what I thought was, if you think it's the people, then it's very easy to say, well, I'm not racist. It's those other people that are causing the problem. And then you don't have to do anything. If you acknowledge that it's the system, then you might have to also acknowledge that you have benefited from a racist system. And so you're a little bit part of the problem. And I think that's a really uncomfortable conversation for people to have and to acknowledge.
Not just benefited from the system, but perhaps contributed to the system. Perhaps your contribution and the way you are engaging is part of the reason that systemic racism exists. I think you're absolutely right. I think it feels better to say it's people, but we know that it's systems. I believe that it is.
Right. And Lisa, the other thing, I mean, if the people, if that argument is the one that some want to make, right, that it's people and not the system, but if the people who are racist or have racist tendencies are judges, are CEOs, are members of Congress who are seeking to disenfranchise American citizens, then what does that tell you?
It tells you that we have a big problem, because it's both. It is in the systems, but it is in individuals. If we look at some of the things that happened with the insurrection and some of the public officials, some of the law enforcement officers that were involved in that. And so either way, we have a problem. And either way, we have a great opportunity to work toward change. So yes, we need to focus on systems, but we also need to focus on people. And I think a big takeaway from this entire research has been, you cannot address 416 years of systemic racism in a summer or in a year. The problems are large. The solutions are complex, but not complicated. And we just have to invest, and that is the role of business. Business is asked to take the lead here, to answer these questions and to lead with a lot of integrity and competency.
So speaking of that, this past summer, something I thought was really interesting happened. We saw more and more businesses sort of aligning themselves with Black Lives Matter, throwing up the hashtag. And I remember there, and to me, it almost felt like it got to the point where if you didn't say something and you didn't say, be Black Lives Matter, then it stood out a little. But you asked people about whether they thought businesses were doing enough when it came to combating racial injustices. What were the numbers that you saw?
The numbers were disappointing. There was only 1 in 3 actually thought that business had worked to move the needle. And you said it, Anne Marie, up front. people were very anxious, and they were well-intentioned, and they were sincere in terms of articulating and verbalizing opposition to brutality, opposition to racism, opposition to discrimination. But the real issue is it's not enough to say something, you have to do something. And I think that's where respondents really held businesses to a significant standard that, yes, you have to say something. And of course, there was peer pressure to say something, but what have you actually done to eradicate or to lessen the problem?
The other interesting details that came out in the report, and this is part of the conversation, so there were, over the summer and in years previous, companies that would put out a hashtag, but what we saw happen in just recent weeks, Coca-Cola, Delta Airlines have spoken out against the passage of the new voting access law that was passed in Georgia. Major League Baseball pulled the All-Star game from Georgia in response. Now, some critics say that law makes it harder for minorities and poor people to cast a ballot. 55% of people surveyed said CEOs are acting appropriately by taking a stand in cases like this. More black people and Asian people, those executives, as did about 66% of Democrats versus 40% of Republicans. What were your takeaways from those results?
I think they were affirming for so many of our clients who were really trying to determine, do I say something here? Do I engage? And for us, our counsel was, if you believe that the legislation is discriminatory or problematic, you have to say something, and you actually have to do something as well. So I think for us, very personally, it was affirming because we knew that so many clients were struggling on whether, do I say something, do I engage? But this, Vlad, was really the example that we're leaning into. During the summer, people said things. I support my Black employees. I support Black Lives Matter. But with the voter registration issue, they did something. And that's what respondents, that's what consumers, that's what employees, that's what constituents are saying. You have to do something. And when they took action, they were rewarded.
So people surveyed actually said overall that workplace culture is their biggest concern on the job. More Black and Latinx people report that their employers have racially insensitive workplace culture, and more Black and Asian people say that there is a lack of diversity in the workplace and leadership. These numbers changed since your last survey in August of 2020. What do you attribute that to?
I think it's progress. I think people are very aware in a way that they have not been before. I don't want to say, Anne-Marie, that the bar is higher, but the bar is high. And I think historically, when all of this happened, there was a question, is this a movement or is this a moment? Because we have seen these moments before. Going back before Emmett Till, we have seen these moments before, but there was something different this time, and it's because people are activists. We have activist consumers, activist students, activist employees, activist colleagues, and people feel this is my world, this is my country, and I'm going to contribute to it, and I'm going to hold other people responsible. So it's not enough for you to say something. As I said, you have to do something. And some of that research also talked about not only, because there are ramifications. Some 50% said, I will either buy or boycott your services, depending on how I feel. And lastly, this concept of inclusivity, we talk about D, E, and I. I have so many clients who are saying, you know what, I realized I totally focused on diversity, but I don't have an inclusive culture. And just because you're diverse and you have more people of color in a community or in a workplace, it doesn't mean that they feel that they belong or that they are inclusive. And that's the path forward, is inclusivity.
More than half the people asked said that the media fails to report on the root causes of racism in the United States. And when you break down the responses by race, more Asian Americans and people agreed with this statement. Is this being driven in large part by an increase in hate crimes against that community during the COVID-19 pandemic? I mean, there were some serious discussions, we had them here at CBS News, around the root causes of what happened, for example, in Georgia, that oftentimes was not addressed in covering the aftermath of those horrific shootings. I wonder if that's sort of evident in these numbers.
I think it absolutely is. It's driven in part by there is people have been tolerant, people have been patient. All of these different groups that we've talked about, communities of color, BIPOC, but we have gotten to a point now where it's like enough is enough. And I'm holding you to higher expectations. There are consequences if you do not only speak and you do not act. And these numbers that we're looking at, Vladimir, Anne-Marie, I expect them to just skyrocket in the future because there has been an awakening and people realize what many of us have known all along. You hold power with your purse. And if you choose to not go to an establishment because you don't believe in their principles or their values, or if you stop going to an establishment, if you decide you're not going to work someplace because you don't believe in the values and the principles are not consistent with yours, even if you disagree, we are different as a people now, and you are seeing that.
Before we let you go, so, people are not familiar with what Edelman does, but I hope they are because, every time you guys put out a report, we usually talk to somebody. It has to do with looking at trust levels within institutions. And I gotta say, Vlad just asked the question about the media. As I was sort of flipping through the report and and looking at the different graphs, like each time I sort of felt myself getting smaller and smaller because the media actually doesn't rank very well in a lot of these and a lot of what your surveys have resulted in. And I'm just sort of curious on your take, if you have any insight into what it is that we're not doing right, or whether or not that perspective is changing, or is it that, what media was a generation ago, which is, whatever, 3 or 4 outlets, the media is, what is called the media, is so diversified now that, we're all sort of being lumped in with somebody's personal blog, to a cable channel. But what's going on? I'm feeling kind of bad because I feel like Vlad and I try really hard to have all these discussions and be very frank and informative.
One, I'm super appreciative of your self-awareness. I'm super appreciative of this awkward moment because that's incredibly important. But it is true when we look at, so the Edelman Trust Barometer looks at trust in 4 institutions that make up civil society: media, government, business, and nonprofits. And media and government for the past several years have been trending at the lowest, with the lack of belief in your competency, and a lack of belief in your integrity. But it is getting better because respondents are saying, media, I need you, but I need you to be clean. I need you to be hygienic with your information. I need it to be informed by a wide array of resources because we rely on media. And to have media as a partner here is incredibly important. Since you raised it, our research in the summer indicated that media actually was fostering stereotypes of Black and brown men, that media was leaning into covering the occasional violence that was related to some of the marches, rather than looking at the volume of peaceful marches and the rainbow of people who were participating. So media plays a role. And it sounds like you and Vlad are all in to help make a difference here.
Well, no, it's such an excellent point, Lisa. And I'm glad Anne-Marie brought it up because she and I talk about this, all the time. And, I also do wonder if part of it is because of the fragmentation of media. Anne-Marie brought up the point that, back when we were growing up, there were 3 networks in this country, including PBS. And there were papers of record. And for the most part, Americans, I wouldn't say that there was always this implicit trust in those institutions, because going back to, you can find speeches and letters that Thomas Jefferson has written when he castigates the media too, and all politicians have since the founding of the Republic. But it is interesting that now, the CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell gets lumped in with an entertainment show on another cable news network that, wink wink, is just asking questions, but really is either spreading propaganda or disinformation. And people will say, hey, all of you guys, like you, meaning me, Anne-Marie, CBS, are lumped into the very same. People sometimes are not even able to distinguish what is written on an op-ed page of a paper of record versus what's actually in the newspaper that is considered news. And so I wonder if
you know what, Vlad?
Yeah.
I think that, the thing about the Edelman survey is, so I don't know if you asked, but we don't know why the results are like that. We don't know if they're lumping us into what together with what we consider to be a more biased outlet. But I think what we can take away is that there is a general sense, even though, I think when we covered a lot of what was happening in the summertime, we would say the majority of protesters were peaceful. But I think that sometimes we have to sort of consider the lasting message, the aftertaste of the news coverage, if you will, to make sure that we're giving people not just the words are not just unbiased, but the sort of lasting story that they walk away with is unbiased and direct.
But Lisa,
can I just pause you right here? The conversation that you just had, we don't hear from journalists. What you all just did was a thoughtful, smart, fair, balanced analysis of something. And quite frankly, people are desperate for more of that. And you made the observation about what I would call the distinction between media for entertainment and media that are rooted in journalism. As a proud graduate of Marquette University's journalism program, I applaud the work that you all do because I watch it, and that's journalism, which is different from media. So I think part of it is the definition of it, but part of it is what you all just did, we don't hear or see a lot of, and I think people are desperate for more of it.
Yeah, that was sort of going to be, I had a long preamble, which Anne-Marie knows I sometimes often do, a big wind up. But the question was going to be, Lisa, is there perhaps a future where you can see splitting up or redefining what media is so that it's a little bit more specific? I don't know if that's possible.
And do you know what? I would ask you that question. You all have such power, and the conversation again that you all just had, that's a conversation among journalists, and people are desperate for that. And I think, at some point, this problem that we have in our country of just being so bifurcated, and if you disagree with someone, when you clearly see red and then you say blue. So it's just like a bad rainstorm. It has to end. And when it does, I do think, pardon me, that media could be the star in all of this in terms of clean, hygienic, thoughtful, balanced information, and then letting me as a consumer decide for myself my opinion. Your job is to tell me the story, and you all do that quite well.
Lisa Osborne Ross, it's such a great conversation. You can tell we're very keen on having it with you, but we're getting the wrap. So we will have to continue this on another day. But it's so great to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Take care.